Okay.
We're just going to wait another 30 seconds or so. We've got a number of people have now joined the session. We'll just give them another 30 minutes, seconds or so for others to come in.
Just taking care of some of those technical things, which should be all good.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our session this afternoon on cybersecurity and data risk, the practicalities and legalities. Paul Paxton-Hall is my name, and it's my pleasure to MC our webinar this afternoon. We've joined in our session with Dark Ice and Matt Crombie in particular, the principal of Dark Ice, because of the need for an understanding of the practicalities around cybersecurity. So we hope that we've put together an interesting combination of the two aspects in our session this afternoon. I happened to be reading the Oz this morning, and there's an interesting article about cybersecurity in this morning's Oz, and it had a definition of cyber extortion. And I thought I'd just read to you what the Australian has said in this morning's edition. It says, cyber extortion refers to the theft of or locking up of data through ransomware. To ensure the data is not released publicly or to have it unlocked, companies are extorted to the tune of millions of dollars. And of course, we know from what's happened over the last few weeks just how savage and cataclysmic a breach of cybersecurity can be. Apparently, there was something like 20 major cybersecurity breaches in the month of November alone, and beyond, in addition, I should say, to that of Optus and Medibank. Something about our speakers this afternoon. So Matt Crombie has been involved in software development for more than 20 years. His business, Dark Ice, is currently involved in software and architecture development. They do a lot of app development and also IT consulting. Nicole Shenfield, the director of Paxton-Hall Lawyers, has a broad commercial practice with particular interest in IT and privacy areas that she covered in her master's degree at Melbourne University a few years ago. Our format for this afternoon is that Matt Crombie will speak first. Matt's session will be for around 20 minutes and will be divided into 3 parts, and Matt will monitor questions in the chat room and take questions at the end of each of the 3 sessions. After Matt's session, we'll pass straight into Nicole's session, and there too, Nick will take questions. Probably easiest if we take questions at the end of the session. So we aim to go for about 50 minutes or so, depending upon our questions. So without further ado, I'll ask Matt to start on the practicalities of cybersecurity and data risk. Matt.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Yep, very good. So I'm Matt Crombie, principal at Dark Ice. I'm hoping to give you a little bit of an overview today at a high level about the technical side, the IT side of what can happen to your business around cybersecurity. So I'm going to, hopefully the presentation settings are right, and you should be able to now see my screen with a giant security eye in it. Getting nods, so I'm going to assume we're okay. Okay, so as I said, very high level. I'm not going to go into anything too specific because every case is different and unique. But broadly speaking, I was hoping to run through 3 different areas, which essentially come around to where we start, how we can protect against that, and if the worst does happen, what do we do? So obviously, the first thing when looking at cybersecurity, think about what the threats and the targets are, whether they're malicious or opportunistic. If someone's disgruntled and has it in for you, are they just after the money? There are numerous countermeasures that we can use here. We can monitor it, we can test it, and we can implement ways to try and protect your IT infrastructure. Now, should the worst happen and you are unfortunate enough to suffer a cyber attack, there's a few things that you can do to hopefully mitigate that and reduce the damage to your business, your IT infrastructure, and everything relating to that. So, jumping in to the threats and the targets. Basically, what you should be aware of. Who's malicious out there? What are they after? Why they might want to do this to you. So, every cheesy is intended here, www. Who, what, and why. Who might want to do something to you? What are they after? And why are they after it? I think, given some of the media recently, we have seen a lot of different reasons people go after things and a lot of different people. The biggest thing I think to state straight away, 100% security is highly unlikely. That said, that should not stop you from trying to achieve 100%. So, I'm sorry, I just had a bit of a lag in my connection there. There are going to be security flaws. Whether you are actually going to be exploited by them is kind of up to you and how you have prepped things. Why hackers might be doing it, there's a lot of reasons. Obviously, ransoming your data, looking for some sort of financial benefit from you. They may want to, just for no other reason, cause harm or anything else. It doesn't really matter what the incentive is. You need to be thinking about what harm this could be doing. And finally, it is trending. It's starting to become a bit of a business where you've got groups in various countries or even internationally, groups such as Anonymous, if anyone's heard of them, who may have a political agenda, a financial agenda. It doesn't really matter. It is trending. It doesn't seem to be a problem that's going anywhere anytime soon, barring some new technology, which keeps coming out, and here we are. So there's a lot of reasons. Definitely something to be aware of. Think about what is a threat to you and what your targets are. Now, there's no question as to why this presentation's come up in the first place. We only have to look at the recent big hacks and the names in the media. I'm sure everyone's aware of some of those recent ones. I won't go into too much here because it is various boring stats, but a few things to keep in mind. 95% of the time, cybersecurity breaches can be attributed to human error. Now, whether that's because it's malicious or just lack of education, or somebody just happened to be tired and configured the wrong thing, human error accounts for the very vast majority. As of last year, in 2021, 70% of breaches were financially motivated. Only 5% motivated by espionage. The reason I bring up espionage is it's not necessarily a foreign government wanting to spy on your business. It could be your competition. Something to think about. This comes back to the targets. Do you have information that would be beneficial to one of your competitors? And if so, and they may not be as ethical as you, could they potentially go after it? 55% of companies do not feel prepared. And the bottom two, I'll just touch very briefly on. 45% of the threats come from the inside. Whether that's intentional or not, that's just the reality. The non-intentional part, email attachments with a Word document or something attached, that accounts for 35% of the breaches. Now, there are several ways that someone may want to attack you, but very, very broadly, and I really do mean broadly here, the way that I would consider it is, are you a specific target or is this just phishing? Targeted attacks are generally considered to be more dangerous. It means someone has more information about you. They are going to potentially pose as somebody that you know. They might have looked at something on your Facebook. They might have intercepted an email. They might just have gone to your website. They have more information about you, which makes it easier to target you. Phishing's more about they've cast a net and see what comes up, hence the term phishing. That said, a targeted attack and a phishing attack are hand in hand in one way. If you're targeted, phishing might be one way they try to attack your business. They might go after your communication channels, something public facing, etc. And going into then targeting it and phishing it at the same time, if that makes sense. So it does sort of go both ways, but whichever way it comes out, whether through phishing, they've realized you might be a target, or they're targeting you and then using phishing to try and get more information to make a more sophisticated attack, you should really be aware of both of these general targets. I say general because there are other things. So you want to be looking at, your data, your client data, your finances, your reputation, anything that could damage you. You should be thinking about this. So, with all of that said, we will soon touch on countermeasures. I'm monitoring the chat and nobody has any questions so far. If anyone does, I would have a brief minute to address any questions, or if there's anything that's not understood, please let me know in the chat. Just give that a moment. I don't see anybody typing, so I'm going to assume we can move on. Okay. So, with all of the doom and gloom, yes, the threats are real. Yes, everything is out there. You're not defenseless unless, and I hate to say it, unless you sort of choose to be. There are definitely steps that you can take to prevent cybercrime and to protect your business. With that in mind, we'll look at it from a high level. So cybersecurity is most certainly not a one-off thing. You should definitely not be waiting for something to happen. Sorry, can everyone hear me again? Sorry, IT problems always happens during a presentation. So yes, cybersecurity is definitely not a one-off thing. You should be working that it's a cycle. And stepping into any one of these points, which is deliberately why I've shown this infographic in this way, I will pick from the left. So monitor and detect your potential threats. Make sure that you're at least aware that something's happening. If someone's sniffing around, you're aware. The next step, and I would probably stress this one the most. Sorry, my headset is really carrying on. There it goes. Okay. I would recommend penetration testing. Now, penetration testing is where you engage professionals who ethically and safely will attempt to breach your systems and then provide you with any flaws. So you've got the good guys looking out for you so that if the bad guys come along, you've already identified it and patched it. You know, if any of you have dogs, you know, it's like patching a hole in the back fence to make sure your dog doesn't get out. So I'm sorry, I'm having so many issues. I'm just going to take my headset off. Sorry, that didn't work either. Is that back? Yes, excellent. Yes, having the good guys test your security before the bad guys do is definitely a very good first step. Once they've done that, you should end up having some sort of report. And again, this doesn't have to be external professionals. You can conduct your own internal review, but genuinely have a look at where your security flaws might be. And then, of course, the obvious one, counter that. Implement measures to prevent a hack. As I said at the beginning, 100% protection it's not very likely achievable, but you should certainly be striving for it. So, with all of that in mind, what are your touch points? Where might you be vulnerable? Where can someone cause damage to your business? A lot of the time, cyber attacks are believed to be linked to an email link or someone with a black hoodie and they have a matrix style green gibberish screen in front of them trying to hack you. And whilst email phishing links are a problem, it's not always the case, especially the matrix part. There's more often than not somebody there in that scenario. You should most certainly, though, be looking at the areas you are vulnerable. Now, this goes for all areas. One example I'll give is a physical area. I know someone who went on a trip. They were meant to have Wi-Fi in the hotel room, but it didn't work. They plugged their laptop directly into the access point with just a good old-fashioned cable, and that gave them access to the entire network when all they were after was simply the internet on their holiday. Whilst harmless, make sure that your data in your offices and all of those touch points are protected so no one can just plug and play. So they can't just plug a cable in. So physical security is a thing. On the more digital side, there's obviously technology out there that can help you. I would myself not recommend attempting to reinvent the wheel. There is a lot out there. There are a lot of professionals, there are a lot of services and a lot of software that can help protect you. That will take you part of the way. Education and processes, making sure that your employees are aware, make sure that you yourself are aware, goes hand in hand with the technology. So this is where you can have things like automated phishing schemes that deliberately try to pick people up within your organization. So if they click on a link that they're not supposed to click on, then you can find out and say to XYZ employee, look, we noticed you clicked on this link. Now it's okay this time, but you should be aware maybe you shouldn't. What also goes hand in hand with that is the actual software again, coming back to that first point. So broadly covering how to secure yourself. How do you respond to an attack? Before I get into it, I'm just going to check the chat once again. So Graham, and Nicole, how often should penetration testing be done? That's up to the individual. There are, of course, budget constraints as to engaging people. If you have your own internal infrastructure and team, then I suppose you have more control. I would say when you make a technology shift, or at a reasonable time that people forget. So maybe 3-6 months, very much to your scenario. So Graham, we use applications like Dropbox, Xero, Office 365. What cyber-led testing of these applications can we sensibly undertake? That is a brilliant question, especially with Office 365, now known as Microsoft 365. Which covers all of Microsoft, not just your Office side. It can cover your cloud hosting side as well. And there are some excellent options available. As I mentioned, deliberate internal phishing testing. So you deliberately try and trick people internally in a safe way to then prevent that from happening going forward. So I myself actually fell for one the other day just due to the timing. It just happened to work out that I was expecting an email from this particular one that one of these random tests was triggered, and I was stupidly overconfident and clicked the link. Now, no harm done, so that's all fine. But it's just that little jogging of the memory to remind you. So yes, Office 365 offers excellent stuff for that. Dropbox and Xero, you want to be thinking about things like two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication. Lizzie, I see your question. Yes, same thing. Again, Xero is just mandated because of the ATO that every 24 hours you have to log in. So that removes a risk of things like you've left your computer open and someone comes along. As a general rule, you should lock your computer when you leave it. Does anyone have any other questions around this?
Sorry, just to clarify, are you saying that within Microsoft 365, it has the ability, you can set up a setting whereby you can send out emails to your staff for testing purposes?
Correct. So you can set things up and say, I want to go and see who's listened to the training and see who you catch. Better to catch it internally than externally. I've just noticed the time, so I'll move on to the unfortunate event. You've been compromised. So you've been hacked. You're at ground zero. Now, what I've seen in my experience is there's a lot around blaming, how did this happen, a little bit of panic. The very first thing, you just want to secure things. Make sure that you identify how this happened as best as possible, make sure that they can't do anything more there, and try and mitigate your damage. After that, at that point, start asking who, what, and why. Why did they do this? If you can. It's a bit of a grey area, but if you can try and figure it out, it will help you with your future decisions around the breach, whether they're after some sort of ransom or to try and gain leverage over you, whatever it is, it may help you, it may guide you to find other potential areas that might be a target. This one is pretty obvious. Once you've identified all of that, secure other areas as well. So they might have breached you through email. Make sure your Microsoft 365 like OneDrive, for example, is secured. Finally, I come back to, I think everyone here is very good at what you do, and so are the people in cybersecurity. If you've already engaged someone for your security, now would be the time to use them. If not, now might be a time to have a look at it. Obviously, it's unique in every business's situation as to what different budgets, what different infrastructure, what legacy things you have, etc. There are professionals out there to help. They will know best. Consequences. Now that you've gone through that initial sort of panic, oh my God, we've been hacked. Start thinking about what your consequences are. So, as I say, common theme, are they after money and a ransom? Do they want to just intentionally cause you harm for whatever reason? Is it espionage? Again, whether it's a commercial competitor, a foreign entity, maybe they just want your information, they got it and they want to move on. How do you handle that? And the last one is probably a rarer one, leverage. If there's information that they've been able to obtain that they could leverage with you. Now, I think everyone is different in the scenario, so I won't mention any specific examples, but if there was something that they could leverage, what is it? And finally, your action plan. How do you respond? Make sure all of your internal communications and external communications are secured. Check all of your public-facing areas. If you have implemented a backup plan and they have held your data to ransom, so they might be saying, you can't have your current existing working files, you can say, well, look, you know what? We've actually got a backup. It's not a big deal. And secure your other accounts. Think about your personal accounts and your company accounts. Overall, try to stay calm, pragmatic. They know you're stressed. Have as much information as possible so that you can make the best decision possible. And then it's up to you to take appropriate action. Now, I realize I've gone a little bit over here. I apologize. So at this point, I'll open the floor to any questions. Just let me tweak some settings here and we should be good. Okay, apologizing for muting everybody. Now, if you want to ask anything, can briefly take some questions.
Yeah, so there's some questions in the chat.
Yes. Okay. Max, out of curiosity, how much would it cost roughly to engage an expert to identify the cause of breach? That varies depending on how big your organization is, what your infrastructure is, what you've got set up. As an example, if you host everything in-house versus in the cloud, chances are it'll be more expensive because it's going to be more custom. When you're using a provider that has already solved a lot of these problems, it's generally, and I really must emphasize generally, a bit cheaper. Lizzie, can you recommend any online training courses which can be used as a general starting point? Yes, some of the Microsoft and others, not saying Microsoft's the only one, just that it's been raised. Yes, they do have training courses. There is a lot of information available online. I'll be sharing this after presentation and happy to drop a couple of names, but it is very, very unique. It's up to you to decide how best to train, I suppose. Brett, is the cloud Azure a more secure option than having local servers? Look, in general, the view is yes, but that's not a only yes. In general, the big players such as Microsoft and Amazon, they've usually solved these problems. So they invest their time and energy in making sure it's secure so that they can make money off you for a lower price than you doing it yourself. Paul, Medibank refused to pay the ransom. Would the ransom industry be put out of business if government's legislative prescribe the ability for income? Yes, that's a very, very good question. We all saw what happened with Medibank, and they literally just everything was disclosed. I think legislation has a lot to do here, and changing things so that businesses don't just, the old line from the movies, you know, we don't negotiate with terrorists. It's kind of the same thing. How you apply that personally is up to you. If it is smaller and it's minor, maybe you're going to decide something else. My personal view is yes, don't. But you need to assess your own situation and the risks to you. Does anybody else have any questions? Happy to take voice at this point or drop it in the chat. And apologies for the very cheesy slide. run reports on the system and obtain the contained sensitive data once data is extracted. Very hard to control. Okay. Apologies if I pronounce your pronounce your name the wrong way. Hasita?
Yeah, that's right. Hasita. Sorry.
Thank you. Yes. So usually what we would do is to put it non-technically, sort of scramble the data in that case. So let's say there's something going on, you're handling data. You might have a production database. When you want to actually have a look at something that might be sensitive, you replace, for example, Matt Crombie with John Doe, things like that. It's about going through and cleaning your data so that, as I've mentioned earlier, even if you did have someone malicious internally, you clean things up so that what they can actually do is mitigated. So you remove that personally identifiable information and they just see, you know, ABC123 as the password. Sorry, that's a very bad example. Passwords should not be decryptable. But yes, like I say, replacing Matt Crombie with John Doe, for example. Again, I apologise. I have talked far too much. I should move on to Nicole. So if that is everything, thank you very much. I hope I didn't waffle on too much. And
well, I probably expect to speak for longer, so I think you're fine.
Excellent.
Okay.
I'm
going to share my screen now. Then. Yeah. That's come up fine. Okay. All right, so thanks, Matt. I think that really lays a nice practical groundwork down for people to then understand how the legal framework fits and sits upon that. So we'll go right into things, noting the time. So the legalities. Firstly, I wanted to cover really 4 main points, and they do sort of fit nicely in or dovetailing with what Matt has said. We need to, it's important to get an understanding of what is our legal compliance risk, where does that lie? Where do those risks lie? We have internal factors as well as external factors. What can we do to mitigate those risks? Again, tying in with where they lie, what we can do internally and externally, and what to do in the case of a data breach from a legal perspective. So the legal risk. Firstly, we have the overarching application of the legislation under the Privacy Act, which I'll go into in a bit more detail. Then the other thing to consider, which I think some people do overlook a lot of the times, is our contractual obligations. This is particularly the case, I guess, with funded entities in the not-for-profit and charity space. Oftentimes that there will be specific obligations in those contracts with government regarding the reporting of obligations, and indeed, and I won't get into it, it's beyond the scope of today's presentation, but there are some specific provisions in the Privacy Act which deal with contracted service providers to the federal government. Whilst I'm on this topic, I think it's timely to, I guess, make the point that some people do get a bit the different sort of frameworks of the privacy legislation conflated. All private sector organisations are covered by the Privacy Act, the Commonwealth Act. Each state has a separate Information Privacy Act, but that only applies to state entities within that state. So we've got the Federal Act, it applies throughout the country to private organisations, and I should say as well as Commonwealth departments and government organisations, and then each state act only applies to the state government bodies. So we'll touch on these 2 points of legal risk further. So the Privacy Act, who is required to comply? We have the Commonwealth government departments, which are agencies under the legislation, and then we have the other term, which is an APP entity, and that includes private organisations. There are a number of exceptions to application, but the most common one is the small business exemption, which means that if you have an annual turnover of less than $3 million, then generally you are not required to comply, but typically there are exceptions to the exemption. And that if you deal in certain types of information or do certain things, it doesn't matter what your turnover is, then you are required to comply. That includes if you are a related body corporate of an entity that is required to comply. So if you are structured as a wholly owned subsidiary of another organisation that is required to comply with the Privacy Act, you have to comply with the Privacy Act. Some other points, some other types of entities as well, organisations that deal with health information, so health providers are required to comply. And I will add that for many, many years, there has been a lot of rhetoric around reducing that limit, that it be less than 3 million, because a lot of fairly large organisations will sit underneath that in circumstances where they probably should be required to comply. So I would expect, based on community expectation and sentiment, that we will see a push towards reducing that limitation, subject to being a weighing up of the cost of compliance. So the key risk, I suppose, for breach of the Privacy Act is whether there is an interference with the privacy of an individual. That will occur if, I've got on the slide, there's an act or practice breaches an Australian privacy principle in relation to personal information about an individual, or an act or practice breaches a registered APP code. I'm not dealing with the codes today. It's outside the scope of today's presentation. We'll be dealing with sort of broad obligations under the Privacy Act. So if you have a concern or have a query around whether you're bound by the Act, please come and speak to me. As I say, this is a very technical piece of legislation. So there are a number of factors to work through to determine whether you're bound by the Act and therefore your obligations. So as a fundamental concept of the Privacy Act is what is personal information, because it only applies to personal information. It is broadly defined to mean information or an opinion about an identified individual or an individual who is reasonably identifiable, whether or not the information or opinion is true or not, and whether or not the information or opinion is recorded in a material form or not. What does that mean? Verbal communication will be bound by that. So I'll give you an example because I think that's it's a bit of a vague, amorphous concept. There was a case that went to the AAT a few years ago now, where an individual made a complaint about his privacy being breached through a verbal conversation he had with a flight attendant at a desk. He was seeking to board the plane. He had a letter from his doctor saying he needed special care, things of that nature, and the conversation, the questions that were asked of him at the time, and the disclosure of the personal information verbally and the way it was done was found to be a breach of his privacy. So that's a sort of a good sort of conceptual example of how the Act can apply to personal information where it's not recorded in a material form or not. So the APPs, that's the Australian Privacy Principles. There's 13 principles, and they range in terms of the obligations, but broadly, they are drafted to reflect the life cycle of information through an organisation. And it's key when you're thinking about the Privacy Act to understand that it is consumer driven. It is based on the consumer, as a lot of our legislation in this country is. But that's the way that the legislation is drafted to think about an individual, how their information is collected, how it is used, how it is held, how it is disclosed, and then ultimately towards we get the end of the APPs, it talks about destruction and things of that nature. So the first APP is APP 1, obviously. That is the APP that requires organisations that are required to comply with the Privacy Act to have a privacy policy which complies with the APPs, and it actually is very prescriptive as to what information must be contained in that policy. It is an externally facing policy, so it is not something that you have within your organisation. It is something that should be available to the public free of charge, usually on your website. And the Commissioner, if they're doing random spot checks and audits, which they do, they will always go and try and find it on your website. Now, again, the Commissioner also has a particular view about the content of that APP, how long it should be, the accessibility, the language used, particularly having regard to who you're working with. A lot of my clients are disability-focused charities, so we have to make sure that those policies are drafted in a way that the people that will read them will understand it. So it's a very critical piece of the privacy compliance puzzle. So outside the terms of today, of course, but just something I wanted to mention because I think it is something that I find a lot of organisations don't understand the relevance and the purpose of it, and also how crucial it is to general compliance. So for today's session, dealing with cybersecurity risk, APP 11 is our most relevant because it deals with the loss of personal information. So APP 11 provides that if an APP entity holds personal information, the entity must take such steps as are reasonable in the circumstances to protect the information from misuse, interference, and loss, as well as unauthorized access, modification, or disclosure. I literally had a phone call from someone today, an IT provider, and they were dismissive of something that had happened because there'd actually been no loss of information. I said, oh, well, I think you'll find the obligation extends also to unauthorized access, not just loss of information. So it is quite crucial to understand the breadth of the statutory obligation. So compliance requires active measures to ensure the security of personal information, which an APP entity holds. What does hold mean? Well, it means possession or control of a record that contains personal information, including, really relevantly, the right or power to deal with. So if you have data stored somewhere with a third party, if you have the right to deal with it, you are considered to hold it for the purposes of legislation. And that's important, meaning that you can't off-risk yourself by using, as the example Brett gave, a cloud services provider, because you technically, if you don't technically hold it because it's not on your server, that's not going to cut it. So again, that's the example I've given in the slide there around holding. What is reasonable in the circumstances? Well, that depends. Typical legal answer. Look at what is the nature of the APP entity? Well, if you're a financial services provider, you should probably have a higher concern around what is reasonable and your security than a fast food shop down the road, because the nature of the information that you hold and the sensitivity of that personal information is greater, of course, and it makes the consumer, again, thinking about the legislation, far more vulnerable to consequences should there be an unauthorized access, loss, or use of that information. Other factors to be considered, I've mentioned possible adverse consequences, and I've also got in there practical implications of implementing the security measure, including time and cost. They're not requiring you to have, 2FA authentication or anything or encryption necessarily, where the genuine risk doesn't necessitate or require that. It's not considered to be reasonable. And of course, whether a security measure is itself invasive. And a good example of that is requiring someone to disclose a huge amount of information to you in order to verify who they are. There is also, this is reflective of another APP, which requires an APP entity to allow people to deal with them on an anonymous basis and also using a pseudonym, because that protects that is all about preserving and respecting that individual's fundamental human right to privacy. So another obligation under the Privacy Act, which I was thinking about, which is relevant to this obligation, looking at risk and the whole issue around there being a breach of the information, is there is an obligation in the Privacy Act, again in APP 11, to destroy or de-identify information which is no longer required. This then ties in neatly with another obligation under the Privacy Act in the first APP 3.2, to only collect personal information which is reasonably necessary for one of your functions or activities. And I think all of us are guilty of getting information from individuals that we just don't need. But from a privacy compliance perspective, that's to be avoided, because the more information you have, the more of a honeypot you are, or the more you've got to protect, and more of if there's a loss or there's unauthorized access to the individual, the person, the consumer is a greater risk of there being harm made to them. I'm running short of time, so I'm just going to probably speed up the pace a little bit. You will probably all be aware of the notifiable data breaches scheme in one way or another, but it is a provision, a whole section of the Act which establishes a scheme under which organisations are required to notify certain people if certain things happen. That includes an obligation to notify each of the affected individuals, but also the Commissioner if certain things happen. So it applies if there's unauthorised access to or disclosure of information, and a reasonable person would conclude that the access or disclosure would be likely to result in serious harm to the individuals, or information is lost and there's unauthorized access to, access to a disclosure is likely, and that itself would result in serious harm. So what that means is that not all data breaches actually, though, do require there to be notification made to the individuals and the commissioner. There is an ability in the Act to remedy that. It's called remedial action. So if you can take action and you do so before serious harm is suffered, and as a result of that, it's unlikely that serious harm will result, then you don't need to notify anyone. But your key to getting to that point is your data breach response plan, and that's something I'm going to talk about in a little bit of time. So very quickly, penalties under the Privacy Act. You may or may not be aware that last week the Privacy Act was amended. One of the major pieces of reform was to significantly increase the penalties. Prior to this, the Privacy Commissioner genuinely was described as a bit of a toothless tiger. It's been a creeping burn. There's been slow changes made over the years in response to community attitudes around this. And I'm surprised that there's been such a laxity in the industry for such a long time. So it's a bit sad in one sense that it's taken the Optus and the Medibank scandal for this to happen, but it is a good thing. And you'll see that the Australian government's now picking up on the way in which the European governments structure their penalties so that they're much more, there's a lot more reason to avoid them, where we've got an amount not greater than 50 million and taking into account the turnover of an organisation. Oh, sorry. So what else is the risk? Yeah, there's another risk that we may encounter: enforcement action following a complaint to OIC, which is the Commissioner, or investigation, remembering that the Commissioner has an ability to start an investigation of their own volition and of their own basis. They don't need a complaint to do anything. They can just start something. So there's numerous powers under the Privacy Act for determination to be made by the Commissioner, and that includes declaratory relief, and that it does also include the payment of compensation for loss or damage suffered to an individual. Very briefly, I don't really have time to go into this now. Time's sort of escaped me. But there's some general principles that are looked at that all come from an old case in the AAT about when an individual should be awarded compensation, and that includes non-economic loss, such as personal feelings. A good example of that was where a couple of years ago an individual was communicating with their doctor, or they had HIV, communicating around possibly engaging in a study. That information was disclosed by way of email. The wrong recipient received the email. So the individual, the patient who had HIV, suffered significant emotional distress as a consequence, brought a complaint, was awarded about $8,000 for that. And the big one as well, putting aside all the legal stuff, your reputational risk. This is fundamental to all our organisations, particularly when you're talking about professional services, charitable services. I don't know any organisation that is immune from this, except, as I say, if you're a fast food services provider, where it's not about the disclosure of information. Where do the risks lie? There's an obvious internal risk where your software, your procedures, nothing is fit for purpose. A really good example, I think, is what Hasitha said earlier around the fact that they can pull reports that have highly sensitive information that the particular staff member does not need in order to do their job. I think what needs to be looked at is a wholesome view of an organisation. Software, the individuals that don't need that information, they shouldn't have access to it because it means it is vulnerable to disclosure. That goes into information handling procedures, as well as your whole privacy compliance, all your documents, all that sort of thing, making sure that notifications are given when they need to be. And really culture, that's the big difference. If there's a culture around privacy compliance from the top down, it will usually filter through. And that it should be driven by the board as well as the CEO. There was another case many years ago involving St. Paul's College, where there was a complaint being made of historical sexual abuse by a former student. It was being considered in the board papers. Those board papers were handed to students to hand to their parents who were on the board, and they had free opportunity to read those documents. I don't think that would happen today in our society, but that's an example of how I think there used to be a lot more laxness around personal information. But that's an example of what not to do. Again, external. When we're looking at external risks, we can't control third parties. So if we're disclosing our personal information to third parties, it's about ensuring that we have some as much as we can, some control, but that's a point of risk. Risk mitigation. Sorry, I'm really speeding through now. I've spoken too much. Again, IT infrastructure should be fit for purpose and compact, as well as the sort of thinking I've got. It's got to be fit for purpose, and not too easily maintainable, nimble, does what it needs to do, but nothing more than that in terms of the disclosure of information. Information handling procedures should be up to date, well understood and adhered to. Training is really important, but not training for the sake of it. Culture, as I said, and speaking back to that board point, making sure your risk matrix that you've got actually refers to not only statutory obligations, but your funding obligations and your service agreements as well, so that you know where your pressure points are about your legal risk that can arise from a data breach. Cyber insurance, I'm not sure how many organisations have it, but probably most should, because a lot of the time it will respond to business disruption as a consequence of a data breach or a hack. As well as some of the other points I had was managing crisis communication and the cost of that, as well as in some cases they will pay your ransom if possible. Obviously, every policy is different. Interruption costs, as well as some penalties under the Act that are payable. But of course, check with your broker about that. And the last point about risk mitigation from an internal perspective is your data breach response plan, including a PR crisis management plan as to how you're going to manage the fallout. In terms of external risk mitigation, this is where we look to your contracts. Do you have indemnities? Do you have obligations to comply and to notify? So even if your third-party organisation isn't required to comply with the Privacy Act, but you are, then you would very much want to ensure that they have an obligation to notify you. And that's because an eligible data breach can occur. If there's been a breach by one entity, then it can be deemed to occur with the other. So in general, it seems to be that if one organisation has ameliorated the situation, then there'll be deemed compliance by both. But it does need to dovetail and work in unison. So consideration needs to be had to that. And in case of a data breach, do what Matt says from a technical perspective. Adhere to your data breach response plan, including PR your plan, and notify your insurer immediately. So I think this is a good opportunity to just briefly go through what a data breach response plan is. We're running short of time. A data breach response plan is your panic stations. We've had a data breach. It is a document which sets out exactly what to do, who to call, how to action it. It is an internal document. It is something that all your staff members should have access to, and it should be very nice and clear. I've prepared many of these when the data breach response scheme came into effect about 3 years ago. It is something that if you've got cyber insurance or you don't have it and you're looking to get it, sometimes your insurer would like to see it. Sometimes, in fact, your insurer simply requires you to notify them as soon as there's a data breach so that they can manage the process. But whatever the process, there needs to be dress rehearsals, because at the time you find out this has happened, you are not going to be able to rationalise and think about what to do. This is your life raft when you find yourself in a situation that you never wanted to be in. So I'd strongly recommend that if you don't have one, get one drafted up. Even if you're not required to comply with the Privacy Act at this point, I still would really suggest that you have it and have your staff trained in it, because it still affects all of us. We will still all have the reputational risk. And none of us, I think, want to be in a position where we've jeopardised our clients' personal information and just simply ignore that. So a few times for questions. I think I had, okay, Jeff, we're dealing with the mining company that requires a scanned copy of its licence prior to allowing admission to the site. They do not provide any advice regarding the company's data security, data retention policy. Basically, it's take it or leave it. Any comments? Plenty. I would absolutely say that they would be required to comply with the Privacy Act. I think that there's certain information on a licence that they do not reasonably require to have. They would probably just need your name and a photo ID. That would be all I could expect that would be necessary for them to verify who your information is. And I'd be quite surprised if they didn't have an up-to-date APP privacy policy, which is what I call that publicly facing policy that should be available free of charge. So I think that's a bit cheeky. And I must say there is particular sensitivity around the adoption of government-related identifiers, which is any sort of number that the government uses. So there's a prohibition on adopting that within an organisation as the reference number for a person, but that demonstrates the sensitivity of that information, that they're holding your driver's license. That's a honeypot that anyone could just stumble upon and then utilise. They can data match. There's plenty of things people can do. What data are you required to keep for former employees, and what happens if this data is disclosed? Graham, I don't think you're required to keep any for former employees. This is a particularly it's a bit of a grey area for some people because, interestingly, there is an exception under the Privacy Act. It doesn't apply to employees, not former employees, but current employees. They don't have a right to request information that you have about them. If you don't, I think what it comes down to is fundamentally, if you don't need the information anymore, get rid of it. Because that's the core of the Privacy Act. So, and you could also de-identify if you don't destroy. You've got to comply with your tax records. There are certain other obligations that you've got, but I would be pretty keen about keeping that as lean as possible, or at least if you're going to store it, do it in a very highly secure way that doesn't endanger the information so that it could be stumbled across by the wrong person. I feel like that was very, very fast, and I apologise for that. I thought I had more time.
I apologise. Part of that was my fault.
And then I guess in the interests of full transparency, I will let everyone know that Matt is actually my husband. So there you go.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Matt. A great combination, good team. I think we've answered all questions. So it just leaves me to thank both of you for this afternoon. We trust the session has been of some benefit to you. It's unfortunate that we have to spend so much time talking about such an ugly topic in many ways, but there it is. So without further ado, have a good evening, and thank you for your attendance, and we look forward to dealing with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.